If you do have an under-preserved product that's growing yeast or bacteria and you use it, you can get an infection. And if you have a compromised immune system, then you can end up with really nasty infection. There's never been any sort of confirmed signs of endocrine disruption in humans with the use of sunscreen, even though they've been used for decades. If you have a different fragrance shampoo, people will think that is cleaning versus greasy. Literally all they changed was the fragrance, and people are just convinced. The level of fluoride in toothpaste and in water is just too low to be all that toxic. A lot of people get canker sores, including me, from toothpaste with sodium lauryl sulfate.
Welcome back to the Rena Malik MD podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Malik, urologist and pelvic surgeon. Today, our guest is Dr. Michelle Wong. Dr. Wong is a doctor of chemistry, a science educator, and a cosmetic chemist based in Sydney, Australia. She has a PhD in medicinal, supramolecular, and synthetic organic chemistry. She is the founder of Lab Muffin. This is an organization that aims to provide easy to understand explanations of the science behind beauty products. She recently published her book, The Science of Beauty: Debunk the Myths and Discover What Goes into Your Beauty Routine. Today, we talked about a number of things, and there's something in this episode for everyone. We talked about what makes an ingredient clean, the truth about parabens, are sunscreens safe, and what do we need to be aware of when we're purchasing men's skincare products, deodorants, shampoos, and even hand sanitizer. Make sure you check it out and let me know what you think in the comments on YouTube, or if you're listening, leave me a comment on Spotify. All right, Dr. Wong, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to talk about everything chemistry today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So what I want to start with is, what exactly does it mean for an ingredient to be clean?
Well, I guess that's the $1 million question, right? It doesn't really mean much, when it comes down to it. So a lot of the time, the word clean is used to kind of give off the idea that something is not going to be harmful to you, and that if it's not clean, then it will be harmful to you. But the problem with that is every ingredient, depending on how you're exposed to it, can be safe or unsafe for you. So even take something like water, for example. Water, obviously, we drink it, it's good for us, we need it in our lives, but then we can also drown in it if we inhale it and we inhale too much. So again, it's route of exposure and dose. And it's like that with every ingredient. It's just a lot of the time, the ingredients that we're looking at are things that we're not actually familiar with. And so it's a lot easier to believe that something like methylparaben, for example, might be dangerous to us. It might not be good for us because, unlike water, we're just not familiar with it.
Yeah, so you brought up parabens, and that's certainly something that people feel like is good to be free of. Now, my understanding of parabens is it's a preservative that's used to sort of expand the shelf life of products. But is it, and there has been some data that it's linked to endocrine disruption or things of that nature. What, in your experience, is the concentration of parabens high enough? Is this something we should be really concerned with?
That's a good question, because parabens are probably the number one unclean ingredient that you see on labels. So they are used as a preservative, like you said. And a lot of the time we think extending shelf life, how long do I really need a product for? But if you have a regular product without preservatives, the shelf life is ridiculously short. We're talking a couple of days, if that. It's basically like food that you're leaving at room temperature. It's just not going to last. Even though we think of food as very perishable stuff that we would eat, so bacteria would also eat it. Bacteria also eat the ingredients in our beauty products really well. So preservatives are necessary, and parabens are one of the safest because they've been used for so long. Now, with all this stuff about endocrine disruption, one of the things we have to take into account is the fact that if we have an ingredient that's really widespread, which parabens were because they were so good at being preservatives, then naturally they're going to get studied more, because if you're a scientist and you want to study preservatives, why would you not study a really popular one? Why would you go for some random obscure one? So we have a lot more data being generated about parabens. And so if you just go on, let's say, PubMed or Google Scholar and look up parabens, you're going to find a lot of scary looking stuff, but you have to keep that context in mind. Now, in terms of whether or not they're used safely in products, well, when you're looking at preservatives, when you're looking for any ingredient that's in a product, when you're a chemist, you go and look up how you're meant to use it, and the manufacturer will generally have some sort of indication, use this at up to 1% or something like that. And those are based on toxicology. So toxicologists have access to all of this safety data, all of these tests on cells, on animals. And then based on that, they'll convert it to what is safe for use in a beauty product on a human, on skin. And based on that, parabens have particular percentages that they're used at. And as we've kind of gotten better at making products, as we've developed better preservative technology, a lot of the older preservatives have actually been phased out. And this isn't really because of evidence of harm. It's more like suspicion of potential harm. So it is like a very precautionary approach. So the longer parabens, like pentylparaben, phenylparaben, like these are things you just do not see in products anymore, because the longer it is, the more likely it is to have some sort of endocrine effect, even though in reality, we've never really observed any actual harm in a human. It's just we don't need them anymore, and so they've been phased out. And so nowadays it's really methyl to butyl, which is like 1 to 4 carbons, like methyl, ethyl, propyl, and butylparaben, which are still used worldwide, including in the EU, which I know a lot of people think the EU has much safer ingredients. They've banned parabens. They haven't banned parabens, and when they lowered the allowed concentrations, they actually said parabens are very safe. This is why we are still recommending them, or at least we are still allowing them at like lower percentages.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you mentioned that in terms of parabens, if we don't have any preservative, that our products are going to go bad really quickly. So is that an issue with these parabens-free products?
Yeah, it's actually become a bigger issue because parabens were so effective. They were really good at preserving products. There are alternative preservatives that have been developed that are also effective, but they don't seem to be quite as effective and not quite as robust. And so these days, you'll see a lot of products that go off faster. And part of that is because people are using newer preservatives and they're not testing them enough, maybe. Or maybe people are assuming that because it doesn't have parabens, it's fine. And then they're not bothering to do the proper safety tests.
Got it. Is there any regulation in terms of looking at shelf life? I know that they have these little signs on products that tell you how long you're supposed to use them for, but is there any regulation? I know in the United States, it's not very regulated, but is there certain regulations that you have to test before you put those labels on your products?
It's weird. So in the US, basically it's illegal to have unsafe products. And then in the EU, they've got lots of like specific regulations on how you're meant to make sure your product is unsafe. So technically it's illegal in both places to not have a safe preserved product. But I guess like in the US, it's harder to work out what that means. If you're less experienced, you have to like rely a lot on industry information. And that seems to be the bigger problem. Like a lot of the indie brands, they're just not aware of like the standards that you're meant to test at. So in theory, or what you're meant to do, what most brands do is they will have the product and they'll put it through several types of testing. So stability testing and preservative efficacy testing. Basically, this is where they put a product at usually a slightly higher temperature, usually somewhere around 40 degrees, 30 degrees, and then they see how quickly that goes off. And then based on a calculation, like I think it's 6 months at 40 degrees is equivalent to 2 years at room temperature. If it goes off faster, then they're like, oh, maybe we should double check if this product is okay. So they try to make it pass as many of these tests as possible before releasing it. Although in reality, obviously, like you can't design a product and then keep it and test it for 2 years before releasing it because, I mean, the market changes so quickly. You're going to be outdated by that point. But there's also stuff like preservative efficacy testing, which is where they actually dump in bacteria into the product and then see how much is left over. So what a good product should be doing if it's got a good preservative system is killing those bacteria that are introduced.
Is there a way to look these things up? If they're doing these testings, do they put that somewhere public where you can look it up?
Unfortunately, not. That would be nice, but I guess like the assumption is brands know what they're doing. They kind of do because like when something bad happens, you generally hear about it. Like I think it was like the Honest company, Jessica Alba's company. Can't remember when, like 5, 6, I don't know. I feel like I'm getting very old, but they had baby wipes that were moldy, and that like I still remember that. So yeah, it's rare when that happens, but it does tend to happen more with smaller companies who maybe aren't quite as sure of what they should be doing.
You know, it's really funny because in brands we trust, but in doctors we don't, right? I think it's like, you know, everyone's always very suspicious of healthcare, but they'll use anything off the shelf. But you know, it is true. There's certainly bigger repercussions for a big brand if you have something that goes wrong. In terms of like what happens if you use products that are expired, like, or have gone bad, what sequelae could you see, or can you tell that they've gone bad?
I guess like the biggest sign that something's gone bad is like some sort of change in color or texture. That doesn't automatically mean that it's necessarily bad. Like, I don't know, I live life on the edge. So like I ignore food expiry dates and just go by gut, which apparently is scientific, but really annoys my husband. It's sort of like that with beauty products as well. Like if you have a change, it doesn't necessarily mean something's gone bad, but what could go wrong is if you do have an under-preserved product that's growing yeast or bacteria and you use it, you can get an infection. And if you have a compromised immune system, then you can end up with really nasty infections. And people have gone blind, and people have like lost, I don't know, they've gotten like extensive scarring. It can be really bad. So yeah, look at the expiry date. Especially with sunscreen. Sunscreen is probably like the one product that I will never use if it's expired, because if it's expired, it's going to stop working. And I live in Australia, so skin cancer is a really big issue here, not risking that.
Yeah, that's really good information because I also live on the edge, particularly with cosmetics. I just forget when I bought them and I like haven't thrown them away. My dear mother is like, I have, cosmetics for years and years. And so hopefully we're not getting breakouts and things like that. So hopefully we're okay. But I think ultimately it's always good, especially for things around the eye, to throw those away because you don't want to get an infection in your eye.
Yeah, that's definitely the other product that I would be really careful of. Mascara tends to be pretty gross, and yeah, your eyes are a high risk area. But a lot of products are quite low risk. So generally, like if you are living life on the edge, the safer products tend to be the drier ones. So bacteria and mold need water to grow. There is water from the air, so if you have a powder product, it can go bad, but it's just less likely compared to, let's say, a moisturizer.
When was the last time a doctor spent an hour with you and truly focused on your goals? And when was the last time you left feeling like you really understood what was going on with your body and had a clear plan of what was going to happen next? At my practice, Rena Malik, MD, I aim to do just that. I specialize in sexual dysfunction, bladder health, hormone health, and pelvic pain for all people. And I want to revolutionize how we take care of patients. I want to really get to know each and every one of you. That's why at my practice, when you come to see me, I'm 100% present with you for an entire hour. And after you leave, if you forgot to ask me something or need clarification on something we talked about, don't worry. I'll respond to your issues and questions quickly through our secure messaging portal without any additional costs. Just go to www.renamalikmd.com/appointments and schedule your visit today. We see patients in Irvine and Beverly Hills, California, and virtually for patients from California, Florida, Illinois, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, and Virginia. If you aren't located in these states, consider making an educational visit where we can talk about your conditions generally, but I can't diagnose or treat you. I can't wait to see you. And so I asked my audience, what they wanted to learn from you. And the number one thing that kept coming up is sunscreen, which I know you talk a lot about. But sunscreen, so there's so many myths, but I'll give a couple that I came across. So one is that chemical sunscreens cross the blood-brain barrier and deposit chemicals in your brain and then cause long-term problems. Is there any validity to this myth?
No, I've looked for evidence on this because I believe it was Andrew Huberman who said it in his podcast and that went viral. Actually, I think he'd said it on someone else's podcast, but a clip of that went viral on social media. And there's just no evidence for this, or at least there's no like publicly available, peer-reviewed, reliable evidence for it. It's possible he has some study somewhere, but it's just really difficult to, I don't think there's any sort of experimental setup that would allow you to make that finding.
Yeah, would you biopsy people's brains after they've used
Exactly.
sunscreen? I don't. But I mean, are there chemicals that are possible to cross the blood-brain barrier and create problems?
It's always possible. That you can't really rule out that that's an impossibility. Molecules are so tiny. You probably have sunscreen everywhere, just one molecule. It's just there are so many molecules in a glass of water. There's 10 to the 23 or something, some stupid number. So yeah, molecules are really tiny, but again, it's the dose that matters. How much there is, the more sunscreen, the more potentially dangerous molecules are in your blood, the more likely they are to actually hit a target. If there's one or two, then it's probably not going to do anything. I can't remember, but there's some number of uranium atoms in everyone's bodies, and it's fine because it's so low. There are some ingredients that can cross your skin and they get into blood. And there was a really big story in 2019/2020, which was the FDA did some studies that found that chemical sunscreens could get through skin and get into blood. The amounts they measured were really, really low. But because the FDA previously assumed that there wasn't enough sunscreen in the blood to ever have to worry about it, that completely changed how they regulated it. Like, it was weird because this assumption has never been the case in other countries. It's just a quirk of how the FDA regulates drugs. So in the EU, for example, they've always known that there's been studies in like the 90s where they found that chemical sunscreens could get into blood, and then they just assess the risk based on that. So a kind of comforting thing is that the FDA and the EU have basically always had the same or virtually the same restrictions on sunscreens in both places, despite these different approaches. So that's a good sign that that is like close to the truth. Like if you go from two completely different but scientifically valid approaches and you get the same answer, it's probably going to be right. It is possible, but it seems like based on how long they've been used, all the data we have about concentration, that it's still safe. So there's never been any sort of, I guess, confirmed signs of endocrine disruption in humans with the use of sunscreen, even though they've been used for decades.
There was another myth that I saw that chemical sunscreens react with the sun and produce significant reactive oxygen species, which then can be carcinogenic.
In theory, that could make sense, but in reality, it just doesn't seem to happen. So there are a couple of chemical sunscreens that do break down in the sun and form free radicals, but I mean, the top 10 or so layers of skin are dead. So if it stays within that, it doesn't seem to make a difference. Plus, you've got extra sunscreen on top protecting the skin. So there have been studies on actual people, and they found that if you wear sunscreen, you end up with less aging skin, like less of that sun damage and less skin cancer. So in practice, that works. And these studies were done in the 90s when the sunscreens were a lot less stable, a lot less effective, a lot less nice to wear as well. And if they've gotten benefits from that sort of sunscreen, then it's really unlikely that our current sunscreens are worse than that.
Yeah, I hear a lot of influencers say, well, cancer rates are going up even though we're using sunscreen. So why, what are the other causes that are causing these cancers to go up, particularly from Australia where it's so common?
I feel like as a doctor, you probably already know all this, but I'll explain it anyway for the listeners. The biggest reason cancer rates are going up is just because we're living longer. That is like the number one thing. So cancer is basically when your cells, every time your cells divide, stuff can go wrong, like little things can go wrong. And every once in a while, one of these things where the DNA doesn't get copied right, that mutation will survive and then it will multiply and it'll become a cancer. Like that's the main cause of cancer. Plus we're exposed to lots of things, including things like drinking alcohol that will make this more likely. And so, yeah, the longer you live, the more you're exposed to like everything, sunlight, alcohol, replicating cells, and you get cancer. We're also getting much better at detecting cancer, especially detecting it early and then treating it early. And so you're going to see an increase in cancer rate regardless, just because of these factors and not because of any sort of like, I don't know, scary chemicals and that kind of thing. So those are the biggest reasons. The other big reasons for skin cancer specifically is just changes in how we behave. So obviously, if you have light skin and you live somewhere sunny like Australia, you're going to get burnt more often, you're going to get more exposure, you have more chances for your cells to mutate. And another big factor is just how we interact with sun. Like we go on a lot more holidays these days, and also we get a lot more like sudden intense exposure, especially like if you're an office worker, you spend your whole year indoors and then you go out on a summer holiday and you just blast your skin with sun for 2 weeks. And that sort of like intense burning UV is really, really good for giving you cancer. Yeah, so those are probably the biggest reasons. I think sometimes like the screening, there are also more screening opportunities as well. There was a study done in the US, which was really interesting. They found that melanoma rates, like the rates of detection, were correlated not with sun exposure, like areas that you would expect more sun, but actually with the number of dermatologists in the area. And so that's a really good sign that it's to do with detecting, and there's a bit of controversy about whether or not that's actually a good thing. Like if you're cutting out all these early melanomas that were never ever going to be a problem, is that good or is that just a waste of money? But yeah, there's lots of factors and it doesn't seem to be any sort of increase in chemical exposure.
Yeah, I think with melanoma, it's probably a good thing because melanoma is so aggressive. But basal cell carcinoma, for example, which of the skin is more on the spectrum of less aggressive, I guess you could debate. But I think generally speaking, when we learn about melanoma, it's pretty aggressive, and if you detect it early, you're lucky. You're sort of the lucky one. In terms of sunscreens, what are some brands that you find are safe and effective for people? Because I think people just want to know, like, what can I buy that I know is good and reputable? And then after that, maybe how to determine, if you don't have access to those brands, which ones are good.
I mean, the standard best practice is the sunscreen that you can afford and wear and can wear a lot of is the best sunscreen for you. Where that gets a bit more complicated is like so many sunscreens feel awful or like they sting your eyes or whatever, some sort of issue that it's really hard to find the right sunscreen. So in general, my favorite sunscreens are not from the US because the US has been really slow in approving some of the newer chemical filters, which is kind of ironic because you hear like the US is lawless and unregulated, but like they've actually not approved these sunscreens because of lack of generally it's like animal-based safety data, and the EU has this ban on animal testing for cosmetics, and so there's this kind of like regulatory clash. But anyway, a lot of the newer sunscreen ingredients are available in sunscreens from the EU, Korea, and Australia, which is actually one of the underrated countries for sunscreen, I think, even though like it is, the sunniest, the highest skin cancer. So yeah, the brands in the US, some of my favorites are Elta MD, has really nice sunscreens, but they are expensive. So then like if you're cheaping out on your sunscreen and applying like the tiniest amount, it's not going to work as well as if you have a less good sunscreen and you slap on heaps. A lot of the store brands in the US are quite good. Like Neutrogena has some really good products. La Roche-Posay has a few nice ones as well in the US. If you are going to go abroad, Korea tends to have really lightweight sunscreens that are like really lovely to apply. My favorite one from Korea is the Beauty of Chosun sunscreen. It feels like moisturizer. I wear it every day without a problem. It probably isn't the best if you're having a lot of exercise, if you're sweating, if you're getting a whole bunch of sun. So it's more of like an everyday commuter sunscreen, but it's just really wearable, works beautifully under makeup, and it's really affordable. So Korea in general is really good for that type. Australia is really good for really water-resistant sunscreens that are cheap and you can apply heaps of, and they will just stay on your skin. So in Australia, if you have any friends coming here and you want them to haul back some products, ask them for the grocery store sunscreens because they are like $10 for a huge pump bottle and it's cheap, and it's probably like, I think it's as nice as the Supergoop sunscreen that you get in the US, but like dirt cheap. We've also got some really nice cosmetic brands like I think Naked Sundays recently launched in the US as well. They've got really nice lightweight sunscreens. Ultraviolet, Airy Day has a really nice physical sunscreen. But yeah, Australian brands, really lovely lightweight. And then EU, you have the sunscreens for really people who are super sun sensitive. Like if you're a redhead and you get burnt super easily, the EU is probably the place to go for super protective sunscreens that probably don't feel that great, but they are just ridiculous. Like they are like a metal mask.
Nothing's getting through.
Exactly.
I've heard of, there's one that actually I think originated in Australia that a bunch of doctors use called Blue Lizard. Is that one that you get in Australia? Am I right, or am I making that up?
Oh, you're half right. So they advertise themselves as Australian sunscreen, but it's not actually available here. It's really weird. It's like, I don't know, weird Australian branding. There's also Australian Gold, which is also not Australian. But yeah, Blue Lizard is a pretty solid one in the US. It's like a physical sunscreen. So if you have a lot of if you get eye sting, if you have a lot of allergies to different chemical sunscreens, Blue Lizard is probably a good bet.
So when do you determine, I mean, obviously personal preference aside, is there any benefit to using physical versus chemical sunscreen?
Honestly, not really. There are some benefits to each. So chemical sunscreens generally feel lighter, but if you're allergic to sunscreens, especially in the US, because you've got limited numbers of chemical filters and the ones you have are the older, more allergenic ones, then you might want to avoid chemical sunscreens. They also tend to sting the eyes. With physical sunscreens, they tend to look white on skin. And so if you have skin that's darker than like lightest redhead, there's a good risk that you'll end up looking like a ghost or like that Mark Zuckerberg photo.
Yeah. And then what about these apps? The Think Dirty, the Yuka, these apps that you scan a product and it tells you how dangerous it is. Are these useful?
No. So these apps, all they do is they look at the ingredient list and then they kind of like flag ingredients that they've decided based on their criteria are dirty. And there's several layers of like, doesn't work. So first off, you need to know the amount to know the dose. Again, it's like how much there is, how many molecules are interacting with your body that make something safe or dangerous. And if you don't have that vital information, you just cannot make any sort of assessment. So that's the biggest problem. Like, by default, they just can't work. And then on top of that, if you actually look at the ingredient ratings, they make no sense. Like sometimes there'll be like two names that are the same. Like there'll be an ingredient with like, let's say, I don't think this is actually an example, but like sometimes you'll get an ingredient where the name means like it's a mixture of two ingredients, and then you go and look up the individual ingredients and they all have different ratings. Like the individual one is rated dangerous and then the combined one is rated safe, which is just like, that makes no sense. So these databases are compiled by people who don't actually understand toxicology, especially UCA. I don't think they have any scientists on staff. The EWG now does, and their ratings have changed a whole bunch over the last few years. So you can kind of see how even they're questioning themselves. So I would just not bother with them. I guess on the one hand, the one useful thing is checking for ingredients that you know you're allergic to. That is really handy. But apart from that, I would just not trust any of these ratings.
Yeah, so I've used it and one time I like had this ingredient that I use all the time, and it was like the only thing that came up was fragrance. So let's talk about fragrance. Is fragrance something that we should be worried about? And is there a difference between fragrance-free and unscented?
I'll start with the last bit because that's the easiest. Fragrance-free generally means there's no fragrance in the ingredients list. There can be ingredients which have a scent, but they have some sort of other function. So phenoxyethanol, for example, is a preservative, but it smells like roses. So it's kind of used in fragrance-free products, but generally people don't have a problem with it. Unscented usually means it doesn't smell, which means that, I mean, a lot of things smell without being fragrance. A lot of raw materials, for example, they might have like a bit of a nasty smell. And so sometimes unscented products will have a masking fragrance to neutralize that smell. So if you're allergic to fragrance, I would probably not even trust those. I would always just flip and look at the ingredient list and check for fragrance. Now, in terms of whether or not it's dangerous, so a lot of where the whole idea that it's dangerous comes from is that the word fragrance, the reason it's used is because, first off, fragrances are really complicated. They're full of like lots of different notes. Like people who blend fragrances mix tons of things together. And so if you listed everything, it would be a mile long, and no one wants to, like, that would be less useful for us as consumers to like, look for ingredients we're allergic to. So that's one reason. The other reason is fragrance is a really big selling factor for different products. Like there are all these studies which have found that things like if you have a different fragrance shampoo, people will think that is cleaning versus greasy. Like literally all they changed was the fragrance, and people are just convinced. So it's a huge trade secret and people want to hide. Like they don't want to tell their competitors what's in their perfume. In terms of the health part, I think that's where a lot of this idea that it's unsafe comes from, because it is kind of hidden from us, and we feel like, maybe they're hiding something really bad. Maybe they're trying to sell their product with something that's long-term dangerous for us. But there are a couple of organizations that look after fragrance. So there's IFRA and there's the RIFM. So these are two international bodies that they have a whole bunch of standards for their members. And these standards are things like you can only use 1% of this ingredient based on toxicology. You can only use 0.1% of this ingredient in a wash-off product, but you can use less in a leave-on product, stuff like that. And these are all based on the same sort of principles and studies that we talked about with parabens. Like scientists have tested these, they have worked out what amounts are safe, and then all their members have to comply. And their members make up, I think it's 80% of the global volume of fragrance. So if you're buying from a big brand that has fragrance on the label, then chances are it complies with these standards, and under toxicology, it's safe. The other thing with fragrance is there's this perception that it contains phthalates, which are endocrine disruptors. But the thing is with phthalates, they are mostly plasticizers. Like they're included in plastics to make sure they're like bendy. And the ones that are in cosmetics, there's only like really one that's widely used, and it's diethyl phthalate, and that one is really safe. So again, it's kind of like with parabens, the chain length makes a huge difference to how safe it is and how much endocrine disruption it causes. And the ones that do cause a lot of endocrine disruption are the longer ones, which are in plastics and not in cosmetics. But because like these names are really long and complicated, I think people have just sort of overgeneralized.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about phthalates, because we do know it's an endocrine disrupting chemical, but if you were to test everyone's urine, they've looked at like 75% of Americans will have phthalates in their urine, and that's because, as you mentioned, it's in these sort of flexible plastic tubings that are used for processing and a whole host of items, personal care items, and so we're constantly, and they don't stick to those plastics, so they go through into the product whatever they're making, and so people are constantly getting exposed to them and urinating them out. And so while we know that in some circumstances they do cause endocrine disruption, and we know certain types of phthalates are more risky than others, generally speaking, I think that's a big, people don't realize how much we actually are already getting in from everything that we do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, exactly. And I believe the biggest sources are probably from food. Like just our food touches plastic, we microwave it, for example, and then it ends up in our food and we eat it. And
Yeah.
then there's also things like dust, like just dust from furniture, from carpets and stuff like that. With babies, I think one of the biggest things is like plastic toys that they put in their mouth, as well as food and drink. And yeah, cosmetic products generally are not a big source. Plus also like phthalates, like our skin is designed to be a barrier. So by default, it's actually quite hard for stuff to get through skin. Like to get skincare that actually works, it's a massive pain in the butt because like you have to get it through skin, which is designed to keep things out mostly. So yeah, like things like food, water especially, like we drink so much water on a day-to-day basis, we don't use very much moisturizer comparatively.
I listened to one of your interviews, and you had mentioned how you sort of fell into this interesting area of expertise of chemistry related to cosmetics because you saw a study that women who are more attractive tended to get more emergency room care. You saw a study that said that. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it was more, I don't know if it was that particular study, but I remember being in first year psychology and they said, oh yeah, if you collapse on the street, you're more likely to get attention if you look good. And I'm like, well, all of my like, back when I was younger, I was like, my mom always told me like, you're smart, you don't need to look good, just like, it's better that you have brains than beauty, which was kind of an insult, but also kind of internalized that. But
It's
then
an
yeah, it's
Asian
like,
mom thing. It's okay.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then yeah, if I collapse on the street, like no one cares. No one knows how smart I am. Like I gotta have some level of like, grooming. And yeah.
Yeah. And that is interesting. I think the other thing is, when you're thinking about these products, there's certainly a bias in terms of like, oh, we're putting all this stuff on our face. And then we, as mothers, we're kissing our children and we're touching our partners. So if it's safe for us and ideally safe for adult men, is it also safe for children?
Cosmetic products are, when they're doing the safety assessments, they do take the most vulnerable parts of the population into account. And generally that's pregnant women. They look at that in terms of safety. Now, for babies in general, they do have thinner skin and they do react to more things. And when they're younger, they are still developing their immune system. They're still learning things like developing allergies. And so there are some things that aren't really safe for babies, or at least they're not recommended just as a precaution most of the time. But sometimes they are bad. So sunscreens, both chemical and mineral, aren't recommended until over 6 months of age. With skincare products, there's this new thing, or it's not really new, it's called the dual allergen hypothesis. And basically it seems like if you expose a baby to a particular food allergen through skin, the immune system's more likely to learn that it's an allergen rather than exposing it through food like orally. So there's all these new guidelines, which are things like if you feed your baby like bananas, make sure like you wipe their skin thoroughly afterwards, make sure like they don't just have food mess all over their hands, because that is going to increase their risk of food allergies. Yeah, food skincare is a really big no-no for babies, which is also part of the whole clean beauty thing. Like there's so many clean skincare lines for babies that are just full of food allergen.
Wow.
And the less refined the ingredients are, the more likely it is there are those proteins, which are the allergens. So yeah, that's a really big watch out, I think, for any new parents out there. Definitely look out for food skincare because it's just so ubiquitous everywhere.
Yeah. People think because I can eat it, it's better for me.
Exactly. And it's almost the opposite really with food allergens.
Yeah, and there's usually a lot of like, I didn't know for the longest time that those apricot bead face washes are actually very irritating to a lot of people because of the apricot. Apparently, it causes a lot of like contact dermatitis for some people. And so I think that, just because it's got fruit or it's got food in it doesn't mean your skin is going to like it.
Yeah, like I think there is this whole perception that natural is safer, but I mean, I live in Australia. Like nature's nasty and like really dangerous. But in general, things that are allergens, there are so many allergens in nature. The most toxic chemical in nature, like Botox, is completely natural. Most toxic, like I think it's can't remember how many more times. I think it's like a few million more times more toxic than the most toxic synthetic ingredient that we found.
Absolutely. I mean, Botox will paralyze you completely if you have too much. Any thoughts on shaving cream for men? So, what particular types of shaving creams they're putting on? Are there things that people should look out for in terms of ingredients?
This kind of general thing with men's skincare is that there's a lot of things like menthol, like cooling and like just fancy ingredients. I think there is still this big perception with male skincare that like if it's painful, it works, or it's like fresher, it's doing something. That's probably the biggest thing to look out for. Yeah, there's so many shaving creams that have way too much menthol, or they have like an unnecessary amount of menthol. It's not necessarily bad for everyone, but if you have sensitive skin, it's probably not a great thing. There's also a lot of aftershave that just has tons of alcohol, which stings. And again, like it's the whole like pain is good sort of idea. Generally, you're looking for something that doesn't hurt. Like things do not have to hurt to work, and generally pain is not a good sign in skincare.
I think that's really important because definitely I've been like sent like some men's specific testers and I've like tried them and been like extremely turned off by the really strong scents or the minty freshness, which we don't see in, I think, either unisex skincare or in female specific, female targeted skincare.
Yeah, I don't know, it must be a cultural thing, I'm pretty sure, because yeah, I think the men's market is just really underdeveloped compared to women. A lot of brands have just been really trying to push men's skincare and like encourage this idea that men can use skincare and it's okay if it doesn't hurt. It doesn't mean you're less of a man, but it just still hasn't taken off.
I wonder why. Well, maybe we can. I mean, I think it's really hard. Like, I try to tell my husband to put skincare on, and he's like, I'm fine. I mean, he'll put moisturizer, but that's it. There's not much more. What about hair care? So I've personally gone down the rabbit hole and been told, been heard lots of things about sulfates are no good, silicones are no good, only use clean hair products. And then actually when I started doing these like very clean free products, I noticed a lot more hair loss. And so, sulfates tend to really clean a little bit better. And I thought maybe it's just the buildup of those products. And so I just want to hear someone who obviously knows those products better than me to explain what's the truth? Like, do we need to be avoiding these products? And what should we be looking for in good quality shampoo and conditioner?
In general, you don't have to avoid anything unless you're allergic. So sulfates are fine, silicones are fine. The main reason that people have found them not good is that they're just using the wrong products for their hair. Like the biggest problem with hair is that it's so diverse. We've got people who have like coarser hair, so like the diameter of the hair is like thicker or like more fine. People have more or less hair, and even within your own scalp you're going to have a whole blend of different types of hair. Plus there's also like straight, curly, kinky, like every level of that, and that makes a huge difference to how your hair behaves, like when you comb it, whether you get breakage or whether like it's better if you comb it wet or dry. So like it's honestly so diverse that seems to be the biggest issue. There's something like if your hair is straight, then it's easier to comb it. Like you get less breakage if you brush it when it's dry. But if your hair is curly, then you get more breakage if you brush it when it's dry. Like wet brushing is safer. So there's just so much variation there that seems to be the biggest issue. In terms of sulfates did used to give a better clean, but I think most of that is because when people started looking for sulfate-free products, they were looking for things that were less stripping. So maybe they had less oil on their scalp, they needed less of a clean. And so cleaning too much was actually not good for their hair. And so when people were making sulfate-free products, they tended to clean less. These days, it's much more of a blend because now there are people looking for sulfate-free because of myths, and they're looking for a better clean. And so, yeah, was never really about the sulfates. It was more about the overall formula. And so now there are all these formulas that are sulfate free but clean really well. So yeah, it's gotten more confusing really. If a product seems to work for your hair, it's good for your hair, is pretty much the bottom line. With silicones, again, this was, I think, mostly a hair type thing. So there are some silicones which tend to cling better to hair, which is good if your hair is really damaged because you need more conditioning. Like conditioning is just putting stuff on your hair to make it smoother. More stuff on your hair is good if you have damaged hair, if it's really thick, coarse hair. But if you've got really fine hair and you've got too much stuff in your hair, then it's going to flop. It's going to like weigh down your hair. If you have curls and fine hair, then it's going to make your curls like hang down and look lank and sad. Yeah, there are some silicones which tend to do that. So dimethicone is one that tends to stick really well to hair. But there are also silicones that don't do that. So my favorite one, amodimethicone, it has a charge on it, like a positive charge. And if too much is already stuck to your hair, then the rest of it repels. And so you can get really thin layers. And people who tend to avoid silicones find that specific silicone really good for their hair. Like people with curly hair, people with colored hair, that tends to work amazingly. Yeah, I guess don't discount anything. Like actually try it on your hair. Look for reviews from people with similar hair to you. And also, you don't have to pay a lot to get good products unless your hair is super fussy. There's a whole bunch of stuff about how supermarket products are terrible for your hair. And that's just not the case. Like supermarket products, a lot of them come from multinational companies who have buildings full of scientists doing their research. The reason they're cheap is because they have that economy of scale. They don't necessarily have worse products. A lot of products that are more expensive have less research going into them. Listen to your hair.
That's really helpful because I think you can start just cycling like, oh my God, I can't have this. Is this okay? Is this okay? I don't know what's okay. Is this all right? Yeah, because I will tell you the truth. I used to use Pantene Pro V for years and my hair looked great. And then I stopped using it because I was like, oh, it's a drugstore brand. I should use something, fancier or better. And I was like, oh, I mean, it does because the silicone does, like if I wanted to do it curly, it doesn't curl as well naturally, but I don't really curl it myself anymore or let it curl naturally anyways. But I think, yeah, it's important to listen to your hair and sort of figure it out.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the time, the things that get targeted in a lot of these like scare campaigns are the more popular products. And they're popular because they work well. So Pantene, I think it works really well for a lot of people. And the main reason people leave it is either it's causing buildup, like it's making their hair too saggy, I guess, which is just like if you use a clarifying shampoo every once in a while, then that problem kind of solves itself. Or pick a product that is slightly less conditioning. And also just like all these scare stories, like it works well for so many people. That's why it's been targeted.
Yeah, I think there's definitely been a lot of scare stories. Particularly, I think there was one like Diva Curl had a big backlash that people were having hair loss because of Diva Curl, and I don't know the specifics on that one, but I definitely remember that one had some backlash for sure.
I think with that one, the main theory seems to be it was actually a no poo product. So it was actually one of this like anti-sulfate backlash ranges where people were saying sulfates are too stripping and here is a much gentler way to wash your hair. And it seems like it was staying on the scalp for too long and having buildup. And one of the things that does cause hair loss is just having a disturbed scalp microbiome. One sort of hack for hair loss is actually using an anti-dandruff shampoo, like shampooing more and keeping dandruff under control will balance your microbiome and make your hair grow better. And it seems like Diva Curl was just like disturbing the scalp because it wasn't cleaning well.
Wow, that's good because a lot of people think anti-dandruff shampoos are too harsh for your hair.
Yeah, I think they can be because some of them were purposely designed to clean really well and for people with shorter hair. And people with shorter hair tend to have less of a problem with conditioning because like the longer your hair is dead, so all it can do really as it grows is get more damaged. I think Head and Shoulders is one that a lot of people say is really stripping. And a lot of that is because it is designed for men with short hair who have dandruff and they just want to like blast everything clean. And that's fine for them. It's not so good if you have longer dyed hair.
Yeah, that's helpful. What about in terms of deodorants? People are very into natural deodorants. They want to avoid aluminum and talc and parabens, as we already talked about talc and parabens. But what about aluminum?
So the reason I'm going to say aluminium because that's what we have here. Yeah, so the reason it works is because it can absorb water and then turn into a plug. And sweating, like not sweating is fine. A lot of people go on about how it's unnatural, which I guess it kind of is, but a lot of things are unnatural and fine, like glasses are natural. And not sweating is fine. Sweating has never really been a big route of excretion. Like we're not getting rid of toxins through sweat to any significant amount. So yeah, not sweating is fine. Aluminium works because it forms the plugs. There's been a lot of stuff about breast cancer and aluminium, but it seems like all of that has just been dodgy research. One example is there was a study which found that there was the most aluminium in the upper quadrant of the breast, and there were also the most tumors in the upper quadrant, but that was simply because the upper quadrant has the most mass. Like, it's the biggest part, it's going to collect the most of everything. There's just been tons of dodgy research on aluminium, a lot of it from like anti-vax communities. There's been like a professor who did a lot of that research, and he's been fired because he was clearly just like down a rabbit hole. There is one problem with aluminium, which is it does sometimes cause cysts for people because it's blocking and people aren't washing it enough. It is pretty hard to wash off if you don't scrub properly. But yeah, if you don't have problems with it, then it's fine. Oh, also some people don't like the stains on clothes. So yeah, those are valid reasons to avoid aluminium. But if you're fine with it, then there's no reason to avoid it. If you aren't fine with it, then if you're going for a more like an alternative deodorant, a lot of the natural ones have a lot of essential oils, and those tend to cause a lot of skin reactions for people, especially because your armpits are like a damper area. Again, you get more skin penetration. So be careful with things with tons of essential oils. There are some products which now they have a lot of acids in them, and that seems to change the microbiome of your armpit and then make you smell less. Like, you won't sweat less, but you will smell less. And you can actually use things like the Ordinary's glycolic toner, which is like this giant bottle that's really inexpensive. That seems to work well. And there's a lot of natural deodorants. I think there's one from Kosas, which is also just based around chemical exfoliants.
Interesting. And then I've seen some dermatologists say using Panoxal, which helps with the odor associated with body odor. Do you know how that works?
So Panoxal has benzoyl peroxide, which is an antibacterial. So again, it's like changing the microbiome, getting rid of the bacteria, because the reason you get BO is not actually because of your sweat, but because when you have particular types of sweat, especially like not so much thermal sweat, but stress sweat and emotional sweat, that has more proteins in it. And then the bacteria go in and chew that up and turn it into BO. So if you kill the bacteria, then you're going to have less BO.
Wait, so your scent changes with stress and emotional stress or emotions?
There's like two types of sweat glands, eccrine and apocrine, and it's the apocrine sweat glands that activate when you're stressed. So if you're just like running and it's hot, you won't secrete as much proteins in your sweat. It'll just be water and salt mostly. But if you're stressed, that's when your apocrine sweat glands turn on, and they produce like basically bacterial food.
So interesting. I learned something new. That's really helpful. And what about with kids? Like, I have two boys, and what kind of deodorant is safe for younger boys?
I guess it depends how young, but generally if they're like teenagers already, then any deodorant is fine. Probably go for one that's like less fragrance, because yeah, just lower chance of sensitivity, and also just better for you really. Just a little bit less lynx smell. But yeah, generally any type is fine. Putting it on at night is probably more effective. So that way, like the aluminium, if they're using an antiperspirant, has time to go in and block up the pores. And also just tell them to make sure they wash their armpits like thoroughly every day.
So let's talk about washing thoroughly. Should they use a loofah? Should they use a sort of instrument of some kind of glove or something to help them really exfoliate that area? Or what is the best way?
Honestly, just like a lot of elbow grease is probably the best way. Loofahs are sometimes a little bit risky because if you don't let them dry properly, they can build up mold, and then that can cause more infections and worse. Yeah, just gets worse. And if they're boys, they're probably not going to be great at keeping them dry.
No.
Yeah, so I think maybe a scrub product might be good. So at least it goes
Okay.
down the drain and they're not building up bacteria.
Yeah. Okay. What about fluoride in toothpaste? So there's a lot of misinformation, I think, around fluoride and it being really toxic at certain levels of fluoride. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so basically just the level of fluoride in toothpaste and in water is just too low to be all that toxic, unless you have a kid who's really young and they're swallowing their toothpaste. Fluoride works really well for reducing cavities. Yeah, and it's quite disappointing that it's getting removed everywhere because it's just been so good. And I mean, I think in most places, dental cover is not the best in terms of healthcare. Like even in Australia with universal healthcare, dental is not covered. Fluoride is fine. It's very good just don't swallow it on purpose. If it's in a toothpaste, if it's in your water, it's fine.
Yeah, I think in kids, we don't generally recommend them using a fluoride-filled toothpaste until they can reliably spit it out because you don't want them swallowing it. And so there's no real concern of like disrupting the oral microbiome or affecting your hormones in any way because you're using toothpaste with fluoride.
No. If there is a disruption, I think the sodium lauryl sulfate is probably more of a problem. So with sulfates, the reason they strip too much is a lot of the time it's the formulation. And in face washes and shampoos, the formulations have changed enough that it seems like sulfates are not a huge problem. But in toothpaste, because of the limitations on what you can put in an oral product, I don't think they've changed it enough. A lot of people get canker sores, like including me, from toothpaste with sodium lauryl sulfate. So yeah, I think that's probably more of a microbiome issue than the fluoride.
I know we talked about scalp microbiome, we talked about oral microbiome, we even talked about vaginal microbiome, but what about skin microbiome? What are things that disrupt the skin microbiome?
Honestly, everything probably disrupts the microbiome to some extent. So yeah, things like if you have a really damp area, that's going to really shift it. Your skincare products probably do shift it to some extent, but at the same time, that can be a good thing. So yeah, microbiome, like the term is really trendy, but what it's actually doing, like things like benzoyl peroxide, which is like the classic acne treatment, it works by shifting the microbiome. Like it gets rid of acne bacteria, which is actually a good change to your microbiome. There are a lot of conditions like rosacea, which seem to be linked to microbiome changes as well. And again, if you have that, then you want to change your microbiome. But yes, generally the research on microbiome so far just doesn't make it easy for anyone to recommend any sort of real product for it. Like there's no like logical way of shifting it to a better microbiome, apart from the things we already know, like benzoyl peroxide. So yeah, I would probably not worry too much. And again, just listen to your skin, look at the results rather than trying to think too much about what mechanisms are happening.
Let's end with a little bit about makeup. So how, again, there's this whole clean makeup thing, and we've sort of talked about that, but how do you pick makeup, right? There's like a whole variety of makeups available. There's different kinds. There's clean, there's not clean, there's vegan, there's, whatever. And so how do you determine like what is safe, or is everything really safe and it's about what you generally like and feels good on your skin?
Generally with makeup, it is the same with the other products. Yeah, everything is largely safe. Like I think we kind of tend to not be grateful enough for how safe everything is these days. Because yeah, if you think about all these scare stories about like how unsafe things are, the actual number of people who have been harmed by makeup, like you hear about things like radium from the 1920s, but you don't hear about people getting actually harmed by makeup these days. There are a few stories like the talc, like there was that documentary Not So Pretty, which went on about talc with like one person who had asbestos in her makeup. But it's just like these like really cherry-picked outliers that like aren't really firmly linked to makeup that are problems. So yeah, I think the biggest thing to look for is really what works well on your skin, like what performs well. And I think with makeup, it's actually one of the easier product categories to work out. Like you can see when a foundation is bunching up and coming off your skin, or like it's the wrong color. It's a lot harder to see if your skincare is working because it's just so much more long-term. So yeah, just go for things that work well. Look for reviews from people with similar skin to you. I think the biggest thing is probably oily versus dry. When you're looking for foundations and stuff, look for stuff that's designed for your skin type.
Are there brands that you particularly like?
There's a lot. So for lip products, I really like Revlon. For eye products, I also really like Revlon, except they tend to discontinue all the makeup I like really quickly for eye makeup. And it's just like a constant cycle of disappointment when I go back and try to buy it and it's gone. For foundations, I'm a big fan of Estee Lauder and Maybelline. Both of those are just really great brands for me. And oh yeah, Trini. So Trini puts out this really amazing tinted foundation. Like tinted moisturizer, really light, and it just makes your skin look like skin while being like nicer, and it's just amazing.
Cool. Very nice. And then one last thing I wanted to ask about was sanitizer. So I had hand sanitizer. So I use it a lot. I've never thought too much about it because it's got a lot of alcohol. I assume it just evaporates and very little of it gets deep into your dermis. But any concerns about hand sanitizer? I mean, with COVID-19, we're using it all the time. Should we be worried about it?
It's actually exactly what you said. It evaporates so quickly that it shouldn't be a big issue. There were a bunch of studies where they looked at sanitizer versus soap, and it seems like soap was way worse for your skin than sanitizer. And that's because soap has surfactants in it. It's going to strip your skin from oils, whereas Sanitizer, it's alcohol, it goes on your skin, it kills the bacteria, and then it evaporates, and your oils are still on your skin. So my mum's a nurse, and it seems like from her and her nurse friends, they found that the biggest problem with sanitizer was actually maybe fragrance. So their hospital, they offered like 3 different sanitizers, and that seemed to cover everyone. So if you are sensitive to sanitizer, if you're getting cracked hands and stuff, maybe look for a different sanitizer. You will probably find one that is fine for your skin.
I think the only thing just for people who, if you're taking care of somebody with diarrhea, make sure you wash your hands or yourself, because you can have certain types of bacteria called Clostridium difficile, which has spores, which hand sanitizer will not clean off. And so certain things, obviously, if they're obviously soiled, but those sorts of things you can then pass on easily to other people. So just to make sure that you're sort of being safe. Lastly, what I want to talk about is microplastics. So microplastics are everywhere now. We know they're in the air, they're in our food, they're in the environment. People are getting, up to 40 micrograms in a lifetime, up to the age of like 70 of microplastics. So we know it's everywhere. There's even new data that shows there's microplastics in our testicles. There's microplastics everywhere, not my testicles, but in men's testicles. And so, in cosmetics, they say that it may be added to certain cosmetics to help with the texture or the way it feels, the smoothness of the product. So are there certain products that maybe have more microplastics and we should be worried about that?
In general, there might be some that have more, but it's generally not something to worry about. So there is this website called Beat the Microbead, which has a whole list of microplastics, and most of the ones that are there are not actually microplastic. Like, I think they just got confused between polymers and plastic. So plastic by definition has to be solid. That's like the main reason why microplastics are concerning, because they are solid, and when they're solid, they do particular things to your body. But yeah, a lot of the ones they've got are things like, they're actually polymers, which just like strings inside your product. They're not like clustered into a solid. And so they have very different risks. They biodegrade a lot more easily. I would be really careful about analyzing that sort of thing. In the US, microbeads were actually banned, I can't remember how long ago, because of a concern about the marine environment. So yeah, you shouldn't be getting many microplastics, if any, in the US. There are some ingredients which are a bit controversial in terms of whether they're actually like polymers that are spread out, or if they might cluster into microplastics. But again, like, skin is just a really good barrier. I would probably not worry about that. I'd be a lot more worried about things like drink and food.
What is something else that you think people need to know that they are getting a lot of misinformation about?
Oh, I think one of the things that's been kind of annoying me is just viral products on TikTok. And like anything viral on TikTok tends to be not true. Products that work way better than you expect. Like, I think there was like banana peels work like Botox, and then there's like some cream that works like Botox, and it's like, no, things don't work like Botox. If they did, we wouldn't have to use Botox.
We don't want to slather things that work like Botox all over our body.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a reason it's like injected in tiny, tiny amounts by a really, really well-trained professional. There's also like a whole bunch of tests, like people are testing foundation on fruit and like sunscreen on toast and lip balm on paper, and it's just like, I think it's really attractive to think that you can test something and definitely make sure it definitely works well based on something like a paper test, but it's just not the case. Like, it's harder, but it's better to just test it on yourself or read reviews.
Why would they be testing it on paper? Like, I'm not sure what they're trying to get out of that.
So I think the paper lip balm one is they'll smear like different lip balms on Post-it notes, and then they'll put water on it, and then they'll leave it for hours. And if the water goes through, then it's not as good a lip balm, which kind of makes sense, because it's like you're trying to seal in water with lip balm, but then it's like your lips move, your lips aren't sitting there like paper, you're not putting like a huge thick layer of lip balm on your lips. Like, there's just so many things that don't quite work with it, but it looks really good in TikToks, which is why they go viral. But yeah, just doesn't work.
So we end our podcast with a few questions. And so what I want to ask is, what's something you know now, and it can be related to your area of expertise or not, what's something you know now that you wish you knew earlier in life?
I guess probably like, I wish I knew that people didn't care that much about anything I was doing. They care more about what they're doing, just to like care less about what other people think.
I always tell people that you're the movie star of your own life, but not anyone else's, right? So like, we all feel like we're the star, everyone's looking at us, but like, no, they're their own star of their own life. And like, they're not looking at you and they're not worrying about what you're doing the same way you are. What is a non-negotiable, something that you do every day?
Honestly, I should really add some sort of ritual to what I do every day, but I really try to have a bit of time where I'm not looking at a screen and I'm focusing on something else, because I mean, my job is all to do with internet and screens, so it's pretty hard, but yeah, I try to have some sort of discipline time. So sometimes it's like going to a gym class where like there's just no way I can be on my phone. I also do a lot of knitting and crochet, and that's really good because like it uses your hands, it's creative, and it just gets me away from the internet for a bit. Although sometimes I just put on like a really long podcast or a movie, which I guess is not, it feels less like screen time, I guess,
Yeah.
even though it technically is. Yeah.
And then what's a health hack or life hack you would share?
Stretch. I feel like so many of my pain problems have just been not stretching enough. So yeah, stretch your hip flexors. Everyone should stretch their hip flexors more. It sorts out so many back problems.
That's one good thing I've gotten from TikTok is there's like a lot of like little clips on hip flexor stretching exercises and they're actually very helpful. And then lastly, what's one thing you would change about the world?
I think it would be getting everyone to think critically a bit more. I think it's really easy these days with like TikTok and social media to just get into this sort of passive consumption mode where you just will believe everything you see. And that's just not a very good way of navigating the world, especially now that we've got access to so much information, but we don't really have the tools to navigate it, I think. Like schools just have not updated their syllabuses quickly enough to deal with that. Like everyone's still learning content rather than like learning how to navigate content. Yeah, so I think better critical thinking in general, just changing that like from the very start of the educational system. And yeah, I guess as adults, we can try to just remind ourselves every once in a while, like, don't believe it just because someone on TikTok said so. Anyone has a camera, anyone can say anything. And I think that would really help the world.
I agree. I cannot agree more. I think there's a lot of, I mean, people want to incite a feeling like I know something you don't know. I have the secret. I know something that your doctors aren't telling you or that your parents aren't telling you, your friends aren't telling you. And like in reality, the majority of the things that people tell you are there because that's what like that's normal stuff, right? And the other stuff is sort of very esoteric. A lot of the research that's done is on animals and you can't extrapolate them to humans, right? So a lot of people will take these animal studies and say this is this thing that works because we saw it works in rats, and like rats are not humans, right? They're not small humans even, they're like completely different species. So I think it's really important to assess the information you're getting and check your sources and talk to people you trust and talk to people with expertise like yourself, who's an expert in chemistry and can understand these chemicals way more than I can ever explain them. So thank you so much for being on the podcast today. It's been an honor to get to know you. I wish you were here in the US and we could hang out, but it's wonderful to do it virtually.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you guys so much for joining me on today's episode of the Rena Malik MD podcast. If you guys are enjoying the podcast, do me a favor, leave me a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This goes a long way in helping us reach people around the world who may be benefited by the content we produce on this podcast. And as always, remember to take care of yourself because you're worth it.